Eliza Carter, a gifted violinist from humble beginnings in Savannah, dreams of more than the quiet, worn notes of her father's old instrument. When a high society event throws her into the spotlight, she's thrust into a world of opportunity, rivalry, and unexpected allies. As Eliza fights for her place on the grandest stages, a mysterious melody connects her past to the present, revealing family secrets that could change everything. Can Eliza overcome doubt, navigate powerful connections, and claim her future? Dive into this tale of resilience, passion, and discovery. Comment, like, and subscribe to follow more stories that inspire and captivate. Eliza Carter's feet ached as she wove between tables, balancing a tray of empty glasses and listening to the hum of conversation that filled the Charleston Grill. The restaurant was always busiest on Friday nights, packed with well-dressed patrons who spoke in low, confident tones about weekend plans and business deals. Their laughter mingled with the faint clink of silverware and the occasional note of piano music drifting from the corner where a musician played to add a touch of elegance. Eliza had worked here for 2 years, and though she carried herself with practiced ease, she often felt as if she were watching life through a window, separated from the world she served. The glittering chandeliers above cast a golden glow that made everything look softer, richer. But beneath the surface, exhaustion weighed heavy on her, pressing into her shoulders and aching in her legs. She forced a smile as she approached a table of regulars, men in tailored suits with voices that commanded attention. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, her voice polite and steady despite her fatigue. One of the men, Mr. Lancaster, glanced up briefly. He nodded, barely acknowledging her before turning back to his conversation. Eliza took that as her cue to slip away, back to the kitchen where the clatter and rush of preparation matched the thrum of her heart. This job, though tiring, was essential. It kept her mother's small apartment warm in the winter and covered the medical bills that seemed to pile up as the months passed. But her shift would end soon, and that thought carried her through the last rush of orders and the endless trips between the tables and the kitchen. By the time she clocked out and pushed through the back door into the crisp Charleston night, the streets were quieter, lined with parked cars and the occasional couple strolling under the soft glow of street lamps. Eliza hurried home, her violin case bumping gently against her back. It was old and worn, the wood dulled from years of playing, but it was her most precious possession. Her father had taught her to play on that very instrument, guiding her small hands over the strings and whispering encouragements that felt like secrets only they shared. Inside their modest apartment, her mother, Martha, was already asleep. Eliza could see the familiar shape of her under the quilt, one arm flung across the pillow as if surrendering to the exhaustion that shadowed her days. Martha had worked at the sewing shop downtown since Eliza was a child, her fingers stitched with lines that spoke of years bent over fabric and thread. Quietly, Eliza slipped into her small room, which doubled as a practice space. The wallpaper was faded, peeling slightly at the corners, and the floor creaked when she stepped on the wrong plank. But none of that mattered when she picked up her violin. The world shifted as she adjusted the shoulder rest and lifted the bow. She took a breath, closed her eyes, and let the first note hum into the air. The music filled the room, soft and aching, carrying with it the memories of her father. She could almost see him sitting in the corner, a smile crinkling the edges of his eyes as he watched her play. Each note was a promise, a reminder that her dreams were still alive, even if they felt out of reach. Eliza played until the notes softened, dissipating into the quiet room. Her fingers trembled as she lowered the violin, a bittersweet ache settling in her chest. It was always like this, a surge of energy followed by the hollow reminder of her reality. She placed the violin back in its case, brushing her fingers over the worn edges where the varnish had faded. The instrument had been her father's lifeline, a piece of him that survived the years he couldn't. A soft shuffle in the hallway made her turn. Her mother, Martha, stood in the doorway, her eyes tired but warm. "I didn't mean to wake you," Eliza whispered, guilt pricking at her. Martha smiled, a gesture that softened the lines etched deep into her face. "You didn't "I just wanted to hear you play," she said. "Your father would be so proud." Eliza's throat tightened at the mention. "I hope so," she said, her voice wavering. Martha stepped forward and brushed a strand of hair from Eliza's face. "One day, this city will hear you play, and they'll know what I've always known. You have a gift." Eliza tried to return the smile, but couldn't shake the doubt gnawing at her. The bills on the kitchen table, the sound of the landlord's keys jangling ominously in the hallway, and the exhaustion that settled in her bones every night, all of it felt like a weight pressing her dreams to the ground. "I should get some sleep," she said, offering her mother a kiss on the cheek before slipping into bed. But as she lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling, the notes of her father's song still hummed through her mind, a reminder that hope could still sing, even in the quietest, darkest moments. By the next evening, the air at the Charleston Grill was buzzing with a palpable energy. The staff whispered excitedly as news spread. Evan Monroe, the man who could turn a simple nod into a citywide ripple, would be arriving soon. The restaurant had been transformed, adorned with soft gold drapes and crystal centerpieces that caught the warm glow of the chandeliers. "Eliza, hurry up with those appetizers!" Mr. Jefferson called, his voice taut with urgency. She nodded and balanced the silver tray on her palm, weaving through the crowded dining area. The room was a swirl of silk dresses and tailored suits, people gesturing with champagne flutes and laughing too loudly at half-heard jokes. The sight made her feel even more out of place. The plain black uniform she wore a sharp contrast to the opulence around her. A bell chimed at the entrance, and the room's collective attention shifted. Evan Monroe had arrived, flanked by a few well-dressed associates. He cut a striking figure with his sharp suit and an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His gaze swept the room, assessing everything in an instant. Conversation softened, replaced by subtle nods and glances that acknowledged his presence without requiring his. "Look at him," Leah whispered, nudging Eliza with her elbow. "Rumor has it he owns half the city and could buy the other half if he wanted to." Eliza gave a small nod, but kept her eyes on her tray. She didn't need distractions. She needed to focus on getting through the night. The minutes passed in a blur of orders and refills. Eliza's muscles moved on instinct, her smile fixed as she navigated the room. But then she heard it, her name spoken with a smooth, commanding edge. "Eliza, isn't it?" Her breath caught as she looked up. Evan Monroe stood a few feet away, eyes narrowed slightly, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes tugging at his lips. The guests around him shifted, eager to see who had captured his attention. "Yes, sir," she replied, careful to keep her tone even. He gestured toward a violin resting on a stand near the hired quartet. "They say you play. Why don't you show us?" Eliza's heart plummeted. She felt every pair of eyes in the room swivel in her direction, curiosity sparking. It wasn't a request. It was a challenge dressed as an invitation. Evan's expression was expectant, as if daring her to refuse. A cold prickle of embarrassment washed over her. She wanted to decline, to quietly step back and return to the kitchen where she belonged. But this was Evan Monroe, a man whose opinions held weight. Refusing him would mark her, might cost her this job and the fragile security it provided. "Go on," Leah whispered, her voice laced with both encouragement and urgency. "It's now or never." Eliza swallowed, her mouth dry as she walked toward the violin. It wasn't her instrument, not the one she knew every inch of, but as she lifted it to her shoulder, the familiar weight brought a shaky comfort. The room quieted, expectant and tinged with a hint of derision. She drew in a breath and closed her eyes. The first note wavered but held. It was a song her father had composed, one she had memorized with every fiber of her being. Each note carried the echoes of evenings spent by the fire, of stories and music that filled their modest home with warmth. As the melody unfurled, the room stilled, the low hum of whispered conversations fading to nothing. There was only the music, the rise and fall of hope and grief intertwined. Evan's smile slipped, replaced by an expression that was almost vulnerable, his eyes distant as though drawn back to some long-buried memory. The guests shifted, the mockery in their gazes replaced by something else. Respect, maybe even awe. When the final note settled into silence, Eliza's fingers shook as she lowered the violin. The room remained quiet, the stillness heavy. Then, a few scattered claps grew into polite applause. She blinked, disoriented, her eyes darting to Evan. His expression had changed, the curiosity now mixed with something more intense, unreadable. "Remarkable," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. But before she could respond, he turned away, slipping back into the conversation as if nothing had happened, leaving Eliza standing there with her heart racing and her mind spinning. The next morning, Eliza woke with the memory of the performance still pulsing through her veins. She had expected humiliation, anticipated the whispers that would follow her through the restaurant. Instead, there had been applause. Brief, yes, but genuine. It was more recognition than she'd ever received outside her small room. "Eliza, you've got mail," Martha called from the kitchen, interrupting her thoughts. She padded out, taking the envelope from her mother's outstretched hand. It was embossed with elegant script that made her stomach flip. Charleston Symphony Orchestra. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter inviting her to audition for the symphony. A burst of disbelief and excitement surged through her, but it was quickly tempered by doubt. She had no formal training, no teacher's recommendation. Why would they invite her? Martha noticed the shift in her expression. "What is it, sweetheart?" Eliza handed her the letter, unable to speak. Her mother's eyes filled with pride, and she reached out, squeezing Eliza's hand. "You see?" Martha whispered. "You're more than ready. This is your chance." But Eliza wasn't sure. She thought back to the way Evan had watched her, the calculating gleam in his eyes. Was he behind this? If so, what was his motive? The questions swirled as she clutched the letter tighter, feeling the weight of possibilities she hadn't dared consider until now. The invitation to audition for the Charleston Symphony Orchestra haunted Eliza through every waking moment. It sat on her bedside table, a silent reminder of the life she could almost touch, but feared wasn't really meant for her. The restaurant's usual hum seemed louder as she moved between tables, carrying plates and drinks, her mind whirring with notes and finger placements. "Eliza!" Mr. Jefferson's voice snapped her from her reverie, bringing her back to the present. "Yes, sir," she responded, hastily setting down a tray of iced tea. He nodded toward the door. "You have a visitor." Her heart stuttered. Visitors weren't common. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the entrance, nerves prickling up her spine. Standing in the doorway, dressed in a crisp navy suit, was Richard Benson, the celebrated music director of the symphony. His silver hair caught the light, and his presence exuded authority. "Eliza Carter," he said, his deep voice carrying the weight of experience. "Yes," she said, swallowing hard. Richard extended a hand. "I don't usually make house calls, but your performance at Evan Monroe's event was intriguing. I wanted to meet you in person and confirm that you intend to attend the audition." Eliza's mind spun. She managed a nod, her throat too dry to form words. He studied her for a moment, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "You have a raw talent, but talent isn't enough. Prepare well. The competition is fierce," he said, a note of challenge in his tone. With a final nod, he turned and left, leaving Eliza staring after him, the weight of his words settling in. When she returned to the kitchen, Leah caught her arm, eyes wide. "Who was that?" He looked important. Eliza took a deep breath, forcing a smile. Just a reminder that dreams come with a price. Evan Monroe sat in his penthouse suite, the city spread out beneath him in a maze of twinkling lights. The night of the event had stirred memories he thought long buried. Memories of his mother, Diana Monroe, playing that haunting melody late into the night while he sat by the piano, absorbing every note. But that was before she died, before music became an echo in his life, a sound he silenced with ambition. The girl at the restaurant, Eliza, had played it exactly as Diana had. The realization gnawed at him. He flipped through the pages of an old journal he'd kept locked away, finding a note in his mother's handwriting. The melody she'd played was unfinished, a secret piece she had never performed publicly. How did Eliza know it? He clenched his jaw, frustration battling with a deeper, unfamiliar emotion. The next day, Evan sent an assistant to gather information on Eliza. What he learned surprised him. No prestigious training, no mentors, just a girl who practiced alone in a small apartment. The idea of her knowing that song didn't add up unless there was a link he was missing. He decided to visit the restaurant again, under the guise of a casual meal. When Eliza approached to take his order, he met her eyes, searching for answers. "You must be getting quite a few visitors these days," he said, a hint of curiosity in his tone. Eliza tensed, recognizing the subtle power in his voice. "Yes, sir. It's been different." He leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I'll be watching your audition." A shiver ran down her spine. Was it a threat? A promise? She couldn't tell. But as she walked away, she felt the weight of his gaze follow her, like a silent question that refused to leave her alone. Eliza sat at the small desk in her room, the symphony's sheet music spread out before her. The notes seemed to blur as exhaustion pulled at her eyelids. The invitation had come with a promise of hope, but also with a heavy dose of pressure. She knew that any mistake in the audition could close doors she hadn't even managed to knock on yet. "Take a break," came a voice from behind her. Martha stood in the doorway, a cup of chamomile tea in her hand. "You'll play better after some rest." Eliza took the tea, its warmth seeping into her hands. "I don't know if I'm good enough, Mom," she admitted, her voice soft and wavering. Martha's gaze was steady, lined with years of quiet resilience. "You've been good enough from the moment you picked up that violin. It's time the world saw it too." The next morning, Eliza showed up at the Symphony Hall for her first rehearsal with the other auditioning musicians. The space was cavernous, the air humming with anticipation. She found a spot at the far end, her old violin tucked under her arm, its worn edges a stark contrast to the polished instruments around her. "Hey, you must be Eliza," said a voice. A woman in her mid-30s with curly auburn hair and a warm smile extended a hand. "I'm Claire Matthews, violist and resident cheerleader for the Nervous." Eliza managed to laugh. "I'm both nervous and grateful," she said, shaking Claire's hand. As they tuned their instruments, the conductor, Henry Whitfield, strode in. His gaze was sharp, his movements precise. "We begin with the third movement. Pay attention to the timing," he said, tapping his baton. The music started, rich and powerful. Eliza's heart raced as she lifted her bow, focusing on the tempo. But halfway through, her fingers slipped, the note splintering into the air. The sound seemed louder than it was, echoing in her ears. "Miss Carter," Henry's voice cut through the room, "keep up with the orchestra. This isn't a solo act." Heat crept up her neck as some of the other musicians exchanged glances. Claire shot her a sympathetic look, mouthing, "You've got this." Eliza took a breath and steadied her hands, willing herself to believe it. That evening, Eliza found herself replaying every misstep in her mind, the weight of the day pressing down on her. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. To her surprise, Evan Monroe stood there, his gaze softened by something she couldn't name. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, though the way he stepped inside suggested he wasn't worried about it. Eliza tensed, crossing her arms over her chest. "Why are you here?" Evan looked around the modest room, his eyes landing on the framed photo of her father. "You played my mother's melody at my event," he said, his voice low. "How did you know it?" Her breath caught, confusion mingling with the realization that his interest in her went deeper than she'd thought. "My father taught it to me. He said it was special." A flicker of recognition crossed Evan's face. He stepped closer, his tone softening. "That song was special. She wrote it, but never shared it beyond our home. Your father must have known her." The connection struck Eliza like a physical blow. Her father had mentioned a muse, a woman who inspired his music, but he'd never shared her name. Now, the threads were coming together, revealing a past neither of them had fully understood. "I didn't come here just for answers," Evan said, his voice taking on a new determination. "I came to make sure you're ready for what comes next. You have something rare, Eliza, but the world you're stepping into isn't kind to dreamers." Eliza's chest tightened, torn between trust and wariness. "Why do you care?" For a moment he was silent, the guarded businessman stripped away. "Because I've seen what happens when talent is left to fade. And I'm tired of watching that happen." The sincerity in his voice settled the question that had been gnawing at her. Maybe this was more than a challenge or a game to him. Maybe, just maybe, they were both searching for the same answers, shaped by the music that had bound their families long before they'd met. The days that followed felt like a delicate dance on a high wire for Eliza. Each rehearsal was a challenge, with Henry Whitfield's sharp critiques cutting through the air like a knife. The pressure to perfect each note was relentless, but every time she lifted her bow, she reminded herself why she was there, not just for herself, but for her parents, and for the memory of her father who had taught her to find hope in the music. But balancing this new world with her life at home was taking its toll. Martha's health had taken a downturn, the long hours of work and worry catching up to her. Eliza would spend her mornings practicing, her afternoons rehearsing at the symphony hall, and her evenings tending to her mother. The weight of it all pressed on her, stretching her thin until she feared she might break. One night, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, Claire caught up with Eliza as she was leaving the hall. "Rough session, huh?" she said, falling into step beside her. Eliza nodded, her shoulders sagging. "It feels like no matter how hard I try, I'm always one step behind." Claire's expression softened. "You're not alone, you know. We've all been there. Henry may seem harsh, but he's pushing you because he sees something in you. We all do." The words offered a sliver of comfort, but doubt gnawed at her. "Sometimes I think I'm not cut out for this," Eliza admitted. "I didn't grow up in conservatories or have famous teachers. I'm just, a girl with a violin and a lot of heart," Claire finished for her, smiling. "And sometimes that's exactly what it takes." Eliza managed a small smile as they parted ways, Claire's encouragement a balm against the sting of self-doubt. But as she walked home, the streets quiet under the glow of streetlights, the weight of her responsibilities crashed back over her. The sight of her apartment, dimly lit and still, sent a pang of guilt through her. Inside, Martha lay in bed, her breathing shallow. "Mom?" Eliza whispered, sitting at her side. Martha's eyes fluttered open, their usual spark dulled by fatigue. "You're home late," she said, her voice thin but full of love. Eliza reached for her mother's hand. "Rehearsal ran long." Martha's fingers squeezed hers gently. "You're doing great things, Eliza. Don't let anything stop you." The tears Eliza had been holding back finally welled up. "I just want to make you proud," she said, her voice breaking. "You already have," Martha replied, eyes closing as sleep pulled her under again. Eliza stayed by her side until the first light of dawn streaked through the curtains, the weight of her exhaustion mingling with a quiet determination. The final week before the audition was a blur of practice, last-minute adjustments, and nerves that buzzed under Eliza's skin like static. Each rehearsal felt like a test, every misstep magnified by the silent judgment of those around her. But the pressure wasn't only internal. Whispers had started to circulate among the other musicians. Rumors that Eliza, the newcomer with no formal training, was getting special attention from the symphony's director, and even Evan Monroe himself. "Eliza," Claire said one afternoon, cornering her in the hallway, "ignore the gossip. They're just envious. It's easier to tear down what they don't understand." Eliza nodded, but the whispers still echoed in her mind as she prepared for the final rehearsal before the audition. The room was tense, every musician fine-tuning their instruments with the precision of surgeons. The conductor's eyes scanned the room, pausing on Eliza. "Let's begin," he said, raising his baton. The music filled the hall, each note precise, rehearsed, and practiced to the point of muscle memory. But when Eliza played, there was something more, a layer of emotion that even Henry Whitfield couldn't critique. She let herself get lost in the music, letting it be an extension of her heartbeat, her breath, her struggle. When the last note faded, there was silence. Henry's eyes met hers, and though his expression was still severe, there was a flicker of approval. It was all she needed to push past the doubt clinging to her. Outside the rehearsal hall, Eliza packed up her violin, fingers still trembling from the rush of adrenaline. As she walked toward the exit, a familiar voice called her name. Eliza. She turned to see Evan standing by the wall, hands in the pockets of his tailored coat, his gaze thoughtful. He stepped closer, the intensity in his eyes making her pulse quicken. "Tomorrow is your audition," he said, though it wasn't a question. "Are you ready?" Eliza straightened, meeting his eyes with newfound resolve. "I have to be." A hint of a smile played at his lips. "Good, because once you step onto that stage, everything changes. Make them see what I already know, that you belong there." The words settled deep, steadying her nerves. She nodded, unable to find the right response, and watched as he turned and disappeared into the evening shadows. The apartment was silent when Eliza returned home, the weight of the coming day pressing on her like a storm cloud. Martha was asleep, her breathing more even than it had been in days. Eliza sat at the small table by the window, the glow of the street lamp casting soft shadows across the room. The violin case sat in front of her, its latch worn and familiar. She opened it and traced the grain of the wood, each mark and scratch a testament to years of practice. Each hour spent dreaming of a moment like this. The doubts that had haunted her whispered at the edges of her mind. What if you fail? What if you're not enough? But she pushed them back, focusing instead on the warmth in her mother's voice, the pride in Claire's eyes, and the strange, unexpected support from Evan Monroe. The moon hung high in the sky by the time Eliza finally set her violin aside and slipped into bed. Sleep came in restless waves, but when she woke, the first light of dawn brought with it a fragile sense of calm. This was it. Today, she would step onto that stage and play not just for herself, but for everyone who had believed in her, for the father who had shown her that music was more than just sound, and for the mother who had worked herself to the bone so her daughter could hold on to her dreams. The morning air was crisp as Eliza made her way to the Charleston Symphony Hall. The streets were quieter than usual, the city's usual hum replaced by an eerie stillness that mirrored the nervous energy churning inside her. She clutched her violin case, fingers brushing the worn handle for comfort. "Today is the day," she whispered, trying to steady the tremble in her voice. The lobby of the Symphony Hall was already busy, filled with musicians adjusting their instruments and exchanging anxious glances. The scent of polished wood and faint cologne hung in the air, mingling with the sound of muted scales being practiced in corners. Eliza felt a wave of intimidation wash over her as she glanced at the other violinists. Their instruments gleamed under the light, and they wore the kind of confidence she could only dream of possessing. "Eliza!" Claire's voice called from across the room, pulling her from the swirl of doubt. Claire walked over, her expression warm and encouraging. "You're going to be brilliant." Eliza forced a smile. "I hope so. Remember, it's not just about hitting every note perfectly. It's about telling a story," Claire said, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this." Eliza nodded, feeling a small spark of determination ignite. Claire's words were a reminder that she didn't have to be flawless. She just had to be herself. Soon, the hall grew quiet as Henry Whitfield stepped onto the stage to address the musicians. His sharp gaze swept over the room, settling momentarily on Eliza, before moving on. "We're looking for more than technical skill today," he said, his voice carrying easily through the space. "We're looking for heart, for the ability to move an audience. Remember that." The weight of his words pressed down on Eliza as she sat and waited for her name to be called. Each performance before hers blurred into a haze of meticulous bow strokes and harmonious notes. Her heart raced when the assistant conductor finally announced, "Eliza Carter." She stood on shaky legs, her grip on the violin case tightening. The walk to the center of the stage felt endless. The bright lights blotted out the audience, leaving only Henry and a panel of judges, their expressions stoic and unreadable. Taking a deep breath, she positioned the violin on her shoulder, her bow hovering just above the strings. The memory of her father's voice came to her then, soft and full of belief. "Play like you're telling them who you are, Eliza." She closed her eyes and began to play. The first notes wavered, but soon found their strength, filling the hall with a melody woven from longing and hope. The sound wrapped around her, steadying her heartbeat as she let the music carry her away. She poured every late-night practice, every whispered prayer, and every ounce of love she had into each note. The judges leaned forward, their expressions shifting from indifference to interest. Henry's brow lifted slightly, the only hint of emotion he allowed. In that moment, the audience didn't matter, nor did the intimidating judges or the pressure pressing down on her chest. It was just her, the violin, and the story she needed to tell. The last note hung in the air, a fragile thread that trembled before fading into silence. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No applause, no whispers, just the thrum of Eliza's racing pulse. Then a single clap echoed, followed by another and another, until the hall filled with the sound of approval. Eliza lowered her bow, her hands still shaking. The applause wrapped around her like a warm embrace, but before she could absorb the moment, Henry stood, his eyes locked on hers. "Well done, Miss Carter," he said, his voice carrying a weight that sent a shiver down her spine. The judges exchanged murmurs, and one of them, a woman with silver-streaked hair, nodded in agreement. Eliza stepped off the stage, her heart thundering as reality sank in. She had done it. She had given everything she had, and for the first time, she felt like it might have been enough. The excitement buzzing in the air was palpable as Eliza walked into the waiting area. Musicians who had once barely glanced at her now nodded in acknowledgement, some even offering quiet congratulations. She scanned the room for Claire, but before she could spot her, she heard a familiar voice. "Eliza." Turning, she saw Evan Monroe standing near the entrance, his eyes trained on her with an intensity that sent a new wave of adrenaline through her. He approached, cutting through the crowd effortlessly. "You played beautifully," he said, his voice low and sincere. Eliza blinked, caught off guard by the compliment. "You were here?" He nodded. "I told you I'd be watching." There was a pause, the noise of the room seeming to dull around them. For a moment, she thought she saw something raw in his expression, a vulnerability that seemed out of place on a man so composed. "Why did you come?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Evan's gaze flickered, the steel of his usual demeanor softening. "Because it mattered," he said. The words were simple, but carried the weight of something deeper, something unspoken. Before Eliza could respond, the assistant conductor stepped into the room. "The judges' decisions will be posted shortly," he announced, and a hush fell over the crowd. Evan's eyes lingered on Eliza for a moment longer before he stepped back, giving her space. The anticipation was a living thing, curling tight in her chest as the list was pinned to the board. Musicians pushed forward, jostling for a glimpse. Claire found Eliza's hand, squeezing it as they moved toward the front. "No matter what happens, you did something incredible today," she whispered. Eliza's eyes scanned the list, her breath caught in her throat until she saw it. Eliza Carter. A wave of relief and disbelief washed over her, and her knees almost gave way. "You did it!" Claire said, pulling her into a hug. The room erupted in congratulations, but Eliza barely heard them. Her gaze found Evan across the room, watching her with a rare smile. She nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the strange journey that had brought her here. The day was far from over, and challenges still lay ahead, but for now, Eliza allowed herself a moment of triumph. For the first time, she felt the weight of possibility press against her, light and hopeful, as if the future she had once dreamed of was finally within reach. The following days passed in a whirlwind for Eliza. News of her successful audition spread through the symphony community, cementing her as the underdog who had taken everyone by surprise. Invitations for practice sessions, casual get-togethers, and even inquiries from journalists began to trickle in. It was overwhelming, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. At the apartment, Martha beamed with pride, her strength seeming to return with each passing day as if fueled by Eliza's success. She carefully framed the congratulatory letter Eliza received from the symphony, placing it on the small mantel next to a photo of Robert. "You've done something amazing, sweetheart," Martha said one evening, pressing a kiss to Eliza's forehead. Your father would be so proud. Eliza swallowed the lump in her throat, her fingers brushing the edges of the frame. I wish he could see it. He does, Martha said, her voice soft but certain. In every note you play. The day of Eliza's first official rehearsal as part of the symphony arrived with a blend of excitement and nerves. The rehearsal hall was larger than any space she'd ever played in, with tall ceilings that seemed to echo even the smallest sound. Musicians milled about, tuning their instruments and chatting, their casual confidence making Eliza feel conspicuous. Claire spotted her from across the room and waved her over. "Ready for round two?" she said with a grin, her friendly demeanor easing some of Eliza's tension. "Ready as I'll ever be," Eliza replied, finding a spot among the violin section. The sheet music before her was familiar but complex, full of crescendos and delicate transitions that required precision and control. Henry Whitfield strode into the room, his presence commanding immediate silence. He raised his baton and glanced over the musicians. "We're starting from the top. Focus on the dynamics, and remember, this piece is as much about restraint as it is about power." The first notes filled the hall, rich and harmonious. Eliza's bow moved with care, each stroke deliberate. But as the rehearsal progressed, she began to lose herself in the music, the familiar tension melting away. Claire's encouragement and Henry's demanding eye kept her sharp, pushing her to adapt to the pace of the more seasoned players around her. But not everyone welcomed her warmly. A fellow violinist named Patrick Nolan, known for his technical prowess and sharp tongue, cast sidelong glances at Eliza throughout the rehearsal. When the music paused for a break, he leaned over, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You played well today," he said, a smile that didn't reach his eyes curving his lips. "Better hope it wasn't a fluke." Eliza's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to nod and stay silent. The room resumed its chatter, and Claire shot her a look of sympathy. "Don't mind Patrick," Claire whispered. "He's just feeling threatened." Eliza's fingers flexed on her bow. If Patrick thought he could unsettle her, he was wrong. She would let her playing speak for itself. That evening, as the sun set and the sky blushed with the colors of dusk, Eliza returned home to find a sleek car parked out front. Her pulse quickened when she saw Evan leaning against it, his expression thoughtful as he looked up at the modest building. "Eliza," he called as she approached, his gaze softening. "Can we talk?" She glanced up at her window where Martha's silhouette moved, then back at him. "I suppose so," she said, crossing her arms as if to shield herself from the vulnerability that followed him. They walked a short distance to a nearby park, the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant sound of traffic filling the silence between them. Evan finally turned to her, the usual edge in his eyes replaced by something she couldn't quite place. "I wanted to congratulate you properly," he said. "You were remarkable at the audition." "Thank you," she said, the words coming out more cautious than she intended. "I didn't think you'd be there." "I couldn't stay away," he admitted. "You reminded me of things I haven't let myself think about in years." The honesty caught her off guard. "Your mother's song," she ventured, the connection between them now undeniable. "Yes," he said, his voice dropping. "She was the one who brought music into my life. Hearing that melody again, it was like she was speaking to me through you." The intimacy of the moment made Eliza's heart pound. "My father told me stories about a woman who inspired his music, someone whose passion matched his own. I never realized it was your mother." Evan's jaw tensed, and for a moment he looked away. "It's strange, isn't it? How music can connect us to people we've lost, even when we don't understand how or why." They stood in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken emotions. Finally, Evan took a step closer. "You have a gift, Eliza, and I know the world you're stepping into. It can be cruel, unforgiving, but I believe in you. If you ever need someone to talk to or to remind you of your worth, I'm here." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, a hint of suspicion in her tone. "Because I see something in you that I thought I'd lost in myself," he said, the vulnerability so fleeting she almost doubted she'd seen it at all. He offered a small, earnest smile. And because some dreams deserve to be protected. Eliza didn't know how to respond. She simply nodded, the warmth of his words settling in her chest as they turned to leave the park. Over the next few weeks, Eliza's days were a blur of rehearsals, long nights practicing at home, and adjusting to the rigorous demands of the symphony. Henry Whitfield pushed her harder than she'd ever been pushed, but with each challenge, her confidence grew. The doubts that had whispered at the edges of her mind became quieter as she learned to hold her own among the seasoned musicians. Claire became her steadfast ally, sharing stories of her own struggles and triumphs. They would often stay after rehearsals, practicing together or just talking about music, life, and everything in between. Patrick, however, continued to be a source of tension. His comments became sharper, aimed at undermining her confidence. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, he stopped her in the hallway. "You think passion is enough, Carter?" he said, blocking her path. "This isn't a fairy tale. Talent without pedigree doesn't last." Eliza squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze. "I guess we'll see, won't we?" she said, pushing past him. The old doubt flared up, but was quickly extinguished by the thought of the people who believed in her. Martha, Claire, Evan, and even Henry's demanding approval. One afternoon, Evan invited Eliza to his home, not as a test or for another performance, but to show her something that connected them both. His home was expansive, filled with art and relics from a life lived in luxury. But it was a small, unassuming piano in the corner of his study that caught her attention. "That was my mother's," Evan said, following her gaze. "She used to play for me when I was young. This was where I first heard the melody you played." Eliza traced the keys, their ivory worn smooth by use. "It's beautiful," she said, feeling the weight of history under her fingertips. Evan sat beside her, the room suddenly intimate and small. She believed that music had the power to heal. "I didn't understand what she meant until I heard you play." They exchanged a glance, the silence filled with understanding. It wasn't just music that connected them. It was the loss, the love, and the rediscovery of dreams that had been buried but never truly forgotten. The days in the symphony became a cycle of intense rehearsals and fleeting moments of triumph. Each time Eliza played, she felt herself grow stronger, more assured. Yet, with the approaching first major concert, where she would play as a soloist, the pressure ratcheted up. Henry Whitfield's expectations sharpened. His critiques were swift and unyielding, leaving no room for complacency. "Eliza!" he called one afternoon as rehearsal wound down, his voice cutting through the room like a conductor's baton. "Stay back a moment." The other musicians packed up their instruments, casting her looks of curiosity and subtle envy. Patrick lingered near the door, pretending to adjust his sheet music while eavesdropping. "Yes, Mr. Whitfield?" Eliza asked, her voice steady but her heart racing. Henry's eyes were unreadable, a mix of severity and something softer. "Your playing has improved, but you still hold back. When you step onto that stage, you must play as if nothing else matters. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," she said, though she felt the weight of his words press down on her. As he turned away, she caught a rare nod of approval. Claire waited for her outside the hall, leaning casually against the wall. "Looks like the maestro had some words for you," she said, raising an eyebrow. "He wants more from me," Eliza said, the adrenaline from rehearsal still thrumming in her veins. "But I don't know if I can give it." Claire's expression softened. "You can and you will. You don't get this far without fighting for it." Their conversation was interrupted when Patrick brushed past them, his shoulder bumping Eliza just enough to make her violin case shift. "Watch it," he muttered, eyes sharp. Claire rolled her eyes as he walked away. "Ignore him. He thrives on making others doubt themselves." Eliza exhaled slowly, a small smile playing on her lips. "I think I'm starting to see that." As Eliza prepared for the upcoming concert, her nights were filled with practice sessions that stretched into the early morning hours. One evening, as she played in the living room, Martha entered quietly, her face lined with exhaustion but brightened by pride. "You know, I haven't heard you play like that since before your father passed," Martha said, settling into the armchair. Eliza paused, the bow hovering over the strings. "I feel like he's with me when I play, guiding me," she said softly, the memory of her father's smile warming her from within. Before Martha could respond, there was a knock at the door. Eliza's brow furrowed as she set down her violin and opened the door to find Evan standing on the small porch, hands in his pockets and an air of quiet urgency about him. "Evan," she said, surprised, "what brings you here?" He glanced past her into the cozy living room, where Martha offered a polite nod. "May I come in?" he asked, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant. Eliza stepped aside, letting him into the modest space that was so different from the opulence he was accustomed to. He took a seat across from Martha, who smiled knowingly, sensing the shift in his usually confident demeanor. "I won't stay long," Evan began, his gaze flickering between mother and daughter. "I came to tell you that there's a benefit concert tomorrow night at the Whitfield Hall. I want you to come as my guest." Eliza's eyes widened. "A benefit concert? That's one of the most prestigious events in Charleston." Martha's smile grew, pride radiating from her. "You should go, Eliza. It's an incredible opportunity." Evan's lips curved into a small smile. "Consider it a chance to observe some of the best musicians up close. It might be inspiring." The sincerity in his voice left Eliza without an argument. She nodded, feeling both excitement and nerves coil within her. "I'll be there." The night of the benefit concert, Eliza dressed in her simple black dress, the one reserved for important occasions. It was far from the designer gowns she imagined other guests would wear, but it would have to do. As she entered the grand Whitfield Hall, the air buzzed with anticipation. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting warm light onto the sea of Charleston's elite. Evan met her just inside the entrance, dressed in a tailored suit that made him look every bit the influential figure he was. He offered a smile that eased some of her nerves. "You look perfect," he said, the compliment sincere. Eliza's cheeks flushed slightly. "Thank you," she replied, taking in the grandeur of the hall. It was lined with rows of velvet chairs, and the stage at the front was set with an array of polished instruments. The concert began, the first notes ringing out with a precision and warmth that captivated the audience. Eliza sat beside Evan, her eyes fixed on the musicians as they played with a grace that took her breath away. She studied the way they moved in perfect harmony, each note a testament to years of practice and passion. "You'll be up there soon enough," Evan said quietly, leaning close enough for only her to hear. Eliza turned to meet his eyes, the usual guardedness gone. "Do you really believe that?" she asked, the question more vulnerable than she intended. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "I've never been sure of anything." The final piece was a sweeping symphony that stirred something deep within her, a reminder of why she had fought so hard to be here. When the concert ended, the applause thundered through the hall, a standing ovation that filled the space with energy and admiration. As the guests mingled afterward, Evan introduced Eliza to several key figures, including Richard Benson, who nodded at her with a knowing smile. "We're all looking forward to seeing you play in the upcoming concert," he said, his tone encouraging. Patrick appeared in the crowd, his expression unreadable as he took in the sight of Eliza among Charleston's elite. He raised a glass in a gesture that could have been congratulatory or mocking. Eliza couldn't tell. Before they parted, Evan leaned in once more. "Remember this feeling," he said. "It's yours to keep." Eliza left that night with a new kind of anticipation thrumming through her veins. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt as though she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days following the benefit concert were marked by relentless practice and an undercurrent of excitement. The orchestra's first major performance of the season was days away, and the air in the rehearsal hall was thick with tension. Henry pushed the musicians to their limits, demanding precision and emotion in equal measure. "Eliza, more vibrato on that passage," he barked, his eyes narrowing as she played. "Feel it in your core." She nodded, sweat beading at her temples as she adjusted her playing. The section came together seamlessly, and Henry's approving nod was the only sign that she was on the right track. During a break, Claire approached, a mischievous smile tugging at her lips. I saw you at the benefit concert, she teased. With Evan Monroe, no less? You're quite the mystery, Eliza. Eliza chuckled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. It was a whirlwind, that's for sure. Good, Claire said, patting her shoulder. A little excitement keeps the music alive. As rehearsal resumed, Eliza found herself playing with a renewed confidence, the memory of the concert and Evan's words bolstering her spirit. The days of playing alone in her small room felt like a lifetime ago, replaced by the electric energy of performing with an orchestra and the knowledge that she had earned her place among them. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Patrick's resentment simmered, his whispered comments to other musicians growing louder. Eliza heard snippets, accusations of favoritism, doubts about her background, and though they stung, she focused on the music, letting it be her shield. Let them talk, Claire said one evening, catching Eliza's glance toward the group. They're just noise. You're here because you deserve to be. Eliza nodded, the words a balm against the insecurities that still tried to creep in. She took a deep breath, lifting her violin once more, and played with a resolve that left no room for doubt. As the day of the symphony's season-opening concert drew near, the anticipation in the rehearsal hall reached a fever pitch. Musicians fine-tuned their parts with meticulous care, their nerves taut as Henry Whitfield pushed them to their limits. Eliza felt the weight of every note as she practiced, knowing that this performance would either solidify her place or cast doubt over her rapid rise in the symphony. Despite her best efforts, the whispers hadn't stopped. Patrick's veiled criticisms had evolved into open snipes, his voice sharp as a bowstring. One afternoon, as the musicians packed up their instruments after rehearsal, Patrick cornered Eliza near the back of the room. "Looks like your benefactor's influence is paying off," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Must be nice to have friends in high places." Eliza's spine stiffened, but she kept her voice even. "I'm here because I earned it, not because of anyone else." Patrick scoffed. "Keep telling yourself that." Before she could respond, Claire stepped in, her eyes blazing. "Back off, Patrick. She's worked just as hard as any of us. Harder, if you count where she started." He narrowed his eyes at Claire but said nothing, turning on his heel and storming out. Claire exhaled, the tension in her jaw softening as she looked at Eliza. "Don't let him get to you. He's just noise, remember?" Eliza nodded, grateful for Claire's unwavering support. But even as she tried to brush off Patrick's words, they lingered like an echo in her mind. The evening before the concert, Eliza stood by her window, watching the city lights twinkle like stars scattered across the ground. The faint sound of her mother moving about the apartment was a comforting reminder of home, of the life she'd fought to build for them both. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Martha called out from the kitchen. "Eliza, someone's here for you." She opened the door to find Evan, his expression a mix of determination and something softer, almost protective. He held a small wrapped box in his hands. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice unusually tentative. Eliza nodded, stepping aside. He glanced around the room, taking in the modest furnishings that spoke of years of quiet perseverance. Martha, sensing the nature of the visit, smiled and excused herself, retreating to her room. Evan turned back to Eliza, holding out the box. "I wanted to give you this. It's a gift my mother left for me, but I think she'd want you to have it now." Eliza's fingers hesitated over the smooth paper before unwrapping it to reveal a delicate brooch in the shape of a treble clef, studded with tiny, gleaming stones. Her breath caught as she realized its significance, an acknowledgement of their shared connection through music and memory. "It's beautiful," she whispered, the weight of the gesture pressing against her heart. "Thank you." Evan's eyes met hers, the guarded walls he often held slipping away. "Tomorrow, when you're on that stage, know that you deserve to be there. Not because of anything I've done, but because of who you are." A lump formed in her throat, and she could only nod. As he left, the warmth of his words stayed with her, a promise that bolstered her against the doubt that lingered. The concert hall was packed, the air electric with anticipation. The chandeliers above cast a golden glow over the audience, which buzzed with excitement as they settled into their seats. Eliza stood backstage, the familiar weight of her violin in her hands. She glanced down at the brooch pinned to her dress, its tiny stones catching the light and reminding her of everything she had worked for. Claire appeared at her side, a reassuring smile on her face. "You ready?" she asked. Eliza nodded, though her palms were damp and her heartbeat thudded in her chest. "As ready as I'll ever be." "Good," Claire said, giving her arm a squeeze. "You're going to be brilliant." The conductor's voice called for silence, and the lights dimmed as the orchestra took their places on stage. Eliza's breath steadied as she walked out, the applause a distant murmur that swelled as she bowed. When she lifted her bow to the strings, the world around her shrank until it was just her and the music. The first notes were clear and precise, resonating through the hall with a richness that seemed to reach every corner. The piece started softly, a delicate dance of melody and harmony. Eliza felt each rise and fall of the music deep in her chest, letting it guide her fingers across the strings with a confidence born of passion and practice. As the music built toward its crescendo, she glanced out into the audience and spotted Martha sitting in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. Next to her, Evan's expression was unreadable, but his presence alone was enough to bolster her. The final movement of the piece was the most challenging, filled with swift, intricate runs that required both precision and emotion. The hall held its breath as she played, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But instead of faltering, she leaned into it, channeling every ounce of her journey, the quiet nights spent practicing, the whispered encouragements of her father, the unwavering belief of her mother, and the surprising support of Evan. When the last note hung in the air, a silence so profound settled over the hall that Eliza could hear her own breathing. For a moment, time seemed to stop, the only sound the distant echo of her final note. Then the applause began, soft at first, then swelling into a roar. People rose from their seats, clapping and cheering, the sound washing over her in a wave of disbelief and joy. Tears pricked her eyes as she bowed, her gaze finding Martha's tear-streaked face and Evan's rare, genuine smile. Patrick stood in the back, arms crossed, but expression softened, the rivalry momentarily forgotten. Backstage, the musicians buzzed with excitement and congratulated each other. But it was Claire who found Eliza first, pulling her into a hug. "You did it," she said, laughing through tears. "That was incredible." Eliza's heart was full, the months of fear and doubt dissolving into something brighter. Hope. She looked over Claire's shoulder and saw Evan standing in the wings, watching with a quiet pride that spoke volumes. When he stepped forward, the noise around them seemed to fade. "I told you this was where you were meant to be," he said, his voice low and sincere. Eliza met his eyes, the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment hanging between them. "And you were right," she admitted, a smile breaking through. "Thank you for everything." The applause from the concert hall echoed into the back room, a reminder that this was only the beginning. Eliza had found her place on the stage, not as a novice or an outsider, but as a musician who had earned her spot. And as she stood there, surrounded by friends and mentors, she knew that whatever came next, she would be ready. The morning after the concert, Eliza woke with a sense of lightness that felt foreign but welcome. The applause and cheers from the night before still rang in her ears, filling the apartment with a warmth that even the cool morning air couldn't dispel. Martha hummed softly in the kitchen, the sound as comforting as the scent of brewing coffee. Eliza was still wrapped in the remnants of her dream when a knock at the door interrupted her reverie. She opened it to find Richard Benson, the symphony director, standing with a small smile. "Good morning, Eliza," he said, his voice friendly but carrying a weight of formality. "Mr. Benson," she replied, stepping aside. "Come in, please." He shook his head. "I won't stay long. I just wanted to say how proud we all are of your performance last night. You brought something special to the stage, something that resonated deeply." Eliza's heart swelled. "Thank you, sir. That means so much." Richard's eyes softened. "I don't know if you're aware, but your father was a musician I greatly respected. I recognized the piece you played, the one inspired by your father's work, and your own unique touch. It reminded me of the old days when passion drove music more than fame or fortune." Eliza blinked, the connection between her father's legacy and her current journey feeling more tangible than ever. "He always said that music was about telling stories that words couldn't." Richard nodded. "You've honored that. Keep playing from your heart, and the rest will follow." With a final nod, he left, leaving Eliza standing in the doorway with a sense of belonging she hadn't felt before. Later that day, Eliza found herself at the cafe where she and Claire sometimes met. The sun filtered through the wide windows, casting warm golden rays on the tables. She was stirring her coffee absently when Evan appeared at the door. He spotted her and walked over, his expression open and relaxed. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "I needed a moment to process everything," Eliza admitted, a smile tugging at her lips. "It's still surreal." Evan's eyes met hers, serious but kind. "It shouldn't be. You've earned this." She looked down at her hands, fingers still slightly sore from the night before. "There's something I don't understand, though. The connection between your mother's music and my father. It's like pieces of a puzzle I can't quite put together." Evan leaned back, his gaze distant as he recalled memories long buried. "I did some digging after your performance at my event. My mother, Diana, was more than just a musician. She was someone who saw the beauty in others' work and wanted to nurture it. Your father was a part of that world. They worked together briefly before life pulled them in different directions." Eliza's breath caught. The whispers of her father's stories about an influential woman who believed in his music made sense now. "So that's how he knew the melody." Evan nodded. "My mother composed it but never finished it. Your father must have taken it and given it new life after she passed. It's strange, isn't it? How music connects people in ways we never expect." A silence fell between them, charged with understanding. "I think she would have liked you," Eliza said softly. "She'd be proud of you, too." Evan's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes glistening with unshed emotion. "I hope so." The weeks after the concert passed in a blur of rehearsals and small performances. The symphony was busier than ever, and Eliza found herself stepping into her role with more confidence. Claire continued to be her guiding light, sharing laughter and encouragement in equal measure. Even Patrick's barbs had dulled, his competitive edge softened by grudging respect. One afternoon, Henry Whitfield called her into his office. The room was lined with photographs of past concerts and framed awards, each a testament to decades of dedication. He gestured for her to sit, his eyes studying her carefully. "You've come a long way in a short time, Eliza," he began. "There's an opportunity I'd like to discuss. The symphony will be touring next season, performing in venues across the country. I'd like you to join us as one of our featured soloists." Eliza's breath caught. Touring with the symphony meant exposure, growth, and a chance to step even further into the world she'd dreamed of. "I'd be honored, Mr. Whitfield," she said, the disbelief still tinged with joy in her voice. He nodded, a rare smile breaking the severity of his features. "You've earned it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Eliza returned home that evening to share the news with Martha, who wrapped her in a tight embrace, tears in her eyes. "Your father would have been so proud, Eliza," she whispered. "And I am too, more than words can say." The next day, she found herself standing in front of her father's gravestone, the winter sun casting long shadows across the grass. She traced the letters of his name with her fingertips, the memory of his voice echoing in her mind. "Music is where we live, Eliza. It's where our stories are told." "I wish you could see it now," she said softly, the wind carrying her words away. But even as she spoke, she felt his presence, not in the stone beneath her fingers, but in the air around her, in the music she would always carry with her. The final rehearsal before the first concert of the tour was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. Eliza stood on stage, the hall empty except for the echoes of the orchestra tuning their instruments. Henry raised his baton, and the music began, swelling with a fullness that made her heart race. Claire caught her eye from across the stage and gave her a wink, the unspoken message clear. "You belong here." As the music soared, Eliza's mind drifted for a moment, catching the glint of the brooch Evan had given her, pinned securely to her dress. It was a symbol of the journey she'd taken, from playing alone in her small apartment to standing on this stage, surrounded by the music that had always been her home. When the final note hung in the air, Henry lowered his baton, and the room fell silent. He looked at Eliza, a rare smile touching his lips. "Perfect!" The applause that followed was muted, just the musicians clapping for their own. But it was enough. Eliza knew that tomorrow would bring another stage, another audience, and another chance to tell her story. And with every bow stroke, she would remember where she came from and the people who helped her get there. The night of the first tour performance arrived with a palpable sense of excitement. The symphony's tour debut was set in a historic theater, its grand architecture reminiscent of times when classical music was the heartbeat of every city. The air buzzed with anticipation as patrons in evening attire filled the seats, their conversations mingling with the subtle hum of the orchestra warming up on stage. Eliza stood backstage, adjusting her bow and steadying her breathing. The polished wood of her violin felt familiar and grounding in her hands, a reminder of everything she'd worked for. The brooch Evan had given her shimmered subtly under the stage lights, a silent testament to the support that had come from unexpected places. Claire approached with a smile, her eyes bright with shared excitement. "This is it," she whispered. "Are you ready?" Eliza nodded, the nerves coiling in her stomach giving way to determination. "I am." Henry Whitfield stepped to the podium and raised his baton. The theater quieted, anticipation pressing down like a shared breath. Eliza stepped forward to her soloist's position, the spotlight warm and bright. She lifted her bow, the audience blurring into a sea of silhouettes as the first note filled the air. The music surged around her, wrapping the audience in a rich tapestry of sound. Eliza played with a confidence that came not just from practice, but from a deep well of emotion. Each note carried the weight of her journey, the lonely nights of practicing, the whispers of doubt, the encouragement of friends, and the steadfast belief of her mother. As the piece built to its climax, she felt a shift in the air, an energy that resonated through her bones. The final note lingered, shimmering in the stillness before giving way to applause that roared like a wave. The audience rose, clapping and cheering, their faces illuminated by the stage lights. Eliza's chest tightened with emotion as she bowed, the sound of the applause wrapping around her like a warm embrace. For the first time, she felt not just the satisfaction of achievement, but the joy of sharing a piece of herself with the world. After the performance, the musicians gathered backstage, the space filled with laughter, congratulatory hugs, and the clinking of glasses as they celebrated the successful opening. Claire handed Eliza a glass of sparkling water, a proud grin on her face. "You were incredible," she said, tapping her glass lightly to Eliza's. "This is only the beginning, you know." Eliza's smile was wide and genuine. "I hope so." A familiar figure caught her eye in the corner of the room. Evan. He stood with Richard Benson, exchanging polite words with a few patrons who had come backstage to meet the musicians. When his gaze found Eliza, his expression softened. He excused himself and walked over, the room seeming to shift around them. "You were mesmerizing," he said, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. "I knew you would be." "Thank you," she said, the gratitude deep in her chest, "for believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself." Evan's eyes held a trace of emotion, unguarded for just a moment. "It was easy to believe in you, Eliza. You've reminded me of what it means to hope." Before either of them could say more, Martha appeared, her smile radiant as she pulled Eliza into a hug. "Oh, Eliza, you were magnificent," she exclaimed, tears glistening in her eyes. "Your father would have been so proud." Eliza held her mother tightly, the rush of emotions nearly overwhelming. "I felt him with me tonight," she whispered. The tour moved from city to city. Each performance met with more accolades and growing recognition for Eliza's talent. She found herself featured in local papers, interviewed by radio hosts who marveled at her rise from humble beginnings to the stage of a renowned symphony. The whispers of doubt that had once followed her were replaced by admiration and awe. Despite the challenges and the long hours, the journey felt lighter with Claire by her side, sharing stories and laughter that made even the hardest days feel worthwhile. Patrick's rivalry shifted into begrudging respect, his critiques softer as he realized that Eliza was not just a passing talent, but a force to be reckoned with. During one of the final stops on the tour, Evan surprised Eliza with a visit to one of the smaller concert halls. After the performance, they walked through the quiet moonlit streets of the city, the sound of the orchestra still echoing in their minds. "Do you ever miss being on stage?" Eliza asked, glancing at Evan. He considered the question for a moment, the shadows of old memories in his eyes. "Sometimes, but watching you has reminded me that music is about more than just the performance. It's about connection." Eliza nodded, understanding more now than she ever had before. The music they shared wasn't just a skill or a job. It was a bridge between past and present, between hearts. The last concert of the tour was set in the Grand Auditorium of New York City, a city that buzzed with energy and expectations. The hall was filled to capacity, with critics, journalists, and music lovers all eagerly awaiting the symphony's closing performance. Backstage, Eliza took a deep breath, her nerves tingling as she adjusted the strap of her dress and smoothed the fabric. Claire gave her a reassuring nod, her own excitement palpable. "You ready to conquer New York?" Claire said with a wink. Eliza laughed, the tension easing. "Let's do it." When the orchestra began, the music wrapped around the room with a richness that seemed to hold every story, every struggle, and every triumph they'd faced. Eliza's solo was the centerpiece, a complex, emotive piece that demanded both technical precision and raw feeling. As she played, she felt every note resonate, not just within herself, but across the audience. The room was silent, captivated, as if holding its breath. When the final note dissolved into the air, the moment of quiet before the applause felt infinite. And then the applause came, thunderous and heartfelt, a testament to her journey and the music she'd shared. She glanced out at the audience, catching sight of Martha, standing and clapping with unrestrained joy. Evan was beside her, his expression one of pride and something deeper, something unspoken. The next morning, Eliza woke in her hotel room to the sound of the city below, the buzz of traffic and life continuing on. She sat by the window, the sunlight streaming through and warming her skin. The tour had come to an end, but it wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Claire and Evan standing there, smiles on their faces. "Good morning, Star," Claire teased, handing her a cup of coffee. "Ready to hear some big news?" Evan's eyes met hers, the corner of his mouth lifting in a familiar, confident smile. "The symphony wants you to headline next season," he said. "They see what I see, what we all see." Eliza's breath caught, the possibilities unfurling before her like a new piece of music waiting to be played. She glanced at Claire, at Evan, at the city outside, and felt the weight of her journey fall away, replaced by a soaring sense of hope. "I'm ready," she said, the words ringing with the certainty she now felt. As she stepped back to let them in, the future stretched out before her, not as a distant dream, but as a path she was already walking. One note at a time. Eliza sat on the edge of her hotel bed, the noise of the city filtering through the half-open window. The morning sun played on the walls, casting shadows that moved like dancers. Evan's words from earlier echoed in her mind. "They want you to headline next season." It was a dream she'd barely dared to voice, and now it was hers to claim. Martha's voice, warm and familiar, came through the phone as Eliza called to share the news. "Oh, Eliza, this is everything your father would have wanted for you, and everything you've worked so hard for." "I wish he could be here," Eliza said, her voice soft with longing. "In a way, he is," Martha replied. "Every time you play, you carry him with you." The reminder filled Eliza with a quiet strength. She knew that wherever she went, the legacy of her father's dreams and her mother's resilience would be with her, woven into every note she played. Later that afternoon, Evan called, suggesting a walk through Central Park. The winter air was crisp, and the park was alive with activity, children laughing as they skated on the ice, street musicians playing under the bare trees. Eliza pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as they strolled. Evan glanced at her, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "You're thinking hard," he said. She smiled, kicking a pebble along the path. "I'm just trying to absorb everything. This tour, the offer, how much my life has changed." He nodded, hands deep in the pockets of his coat. "It's a lot to take in, but you've earned every moment." They stopped by a bench overlooking the pond, the skyline of the city stretching behind it. The water rippled gently, catching the light. "Evan," she began, turning to face him, "thank you for being there. I didn't expect any of this, least of all your support." His expression softened, and for a moment, the guarded businessman she'd first met was gone. "I didn't expect it either," he said, "but sometimes life brings people together in ways we can't predict. Your music reminded me of what really matters." They stood in comfortable silence, the cold nipping at their cheeks. The past year had been filled with unexpected twists, but standing there, Eliza felt ready for whatever came next. The evening brought a small gathering of the musicians at a cozy bistro Claire had recommended. The space was warm, filled with the chatter of friends and the clinking of glasses. Patrick, to everyone's surprise, raised his glass during a pause in the conversation. "To Eliza," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "You've shown us that passion and perseverance can outshine pedigree." A ripple of applause and laughter followed, and Eliza felt a flush of gratitude. She glanced at Claire, who mouthed, "See? Even Patrick's on your side now." Evan arrived later, slipping into the seat next to Eliza. "Looks like you're the guest of honor," he said, a playful glint in his eyes. "Seems that way," she replied, the warmth in her chest spreading as she took in the scene. These people had become her family, bonded not just by music, but by the shared struggles and triumphs that came with it. The next day, Eliza found herself back at the concert hall, this time walking through its grand corridors not as an aspiring musician, but as the symphony's future headline soloist. The tour's success had opened doors she hadn't imagined, and now her name was spoken alongside those of renowned performers. Richard Benson met her in the hall, his face marked with a rare grin. "Eliza, I wanted to discuss the schedule for next season. We're thinking of featuring one of your father's compositions, paired with the piece you've made your own." Her breath caught, the idea sending a thrill down her spine. "That would be incredible." Richard's expression turned thoughtful. "You have a gift, Eliza, not just for playing, but for connecting with people. Use it well." She nodded, the responsibility sinking in with its full weight. This was her chance to honor her father's legacy while carving out her own path. The season premiere arrived sooner than Eliza expected, bringing with it a sense of déjà vu mixed with newfound confidence. As she stood in the wings, waiting to step out onto the stage, she glanced at the packed house. Among the faces were Martha, seated proudly in the front row, and Evan, his presence a steady source of support. The conductor signaled for her, and she stepped forward, the audience quieting to a hush. She lifted her violin and began to play the piece that had once been her father's unfinished dream. The notes were infused with her story now. Every struggle, every victory, every connection that had shaped her journey. The music carried her, each note a bridge between past and present, between the father who'd first placed a violin in her tiny hands and the future she now faced with certainty. When the final note resonated and faded into silence, the audience erupted in applause, the sound a roaring affirmation of her place in the world. Eliza bowed, her heart full. She was no longer just a girl playing in a small room to an audience of one. She was an artist, a storyteller, and a dreamer who had stepped into the light. As the applause continued, she met Evan's eyes, and he nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of everything they'd shared, learned, and become. In that moment, Eliza knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The applause from the season premiere had barely faded when Eliza found herself immersed in a whirlwind of performances, interviews, and opportunities. The acclaim she received was more than she had imagined, but the rush of success did not pull her away from her roots. Instead, it anchored her more firmly to the lessons learned and the people who had helped her along the way. Months later, Eliza stood on the steps of her childhood home in Savannah. The air smelled like magnolias and sun-warmed earth, a nostalgic reminder of simpler days. Martha greeted her with open arms, pride radiating from her smile. "I always knew you'd come back," Martha said, her voice full of emotion as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Eliza nodded, her gaze drifting to the old music room window, now dark but forever etched in her memory. "This will always be home," she said, and it was true. No matter how far she traveled or how many stages she graced, Savannah would always be the place where her journey began. A few weeks after her return, Eliza organized a benefit concert at the local community center. It was her way of giving back to the place that had nurtured her dreams when they were fragile and uncertain. Claire traveled down from New York to play alongside her, their friendship stronger than ever, forged through shared ambition and triumphs. The concert was small compared to the grand venues she was used to, but it was filled with familiar faces, neighbors who had watched her grow, old friends who had cheered for her even when the applause was silent. Among them was Patrick, who had driven down to show his support, his competitive edge now replaced with genuine admiration. As the first notes filled the room, Eliza played not for acclaim or recognition, but for the sheer joy of sharing music with those who had helped her find her way. The song she chose was a new piece, composed by her and inspired by the melody her father had cherished. It was a bridge between the past and the future, a celebration of the resilience and hope that carried her forward. Evan joined the audience partway through, slipping into a seat at the back. His presence was quiet but meaningful, a reminder of the journey that had connected them. After the concert, as people mingled and exchanged congratulations, he approached Eliza. "Always saving the best seats," he said with a smile, hands in his pockets. Eliza laughed, the warmth of their shared history enveloping them. "You've seen me at my worst and at my best," she said. "I think that earns you a permanent front-row spot." Their laughter settled into a companionable silence. "What's next for you?" Evan asked, a note of genuine curiosity in his voice. Eliza's eyes sparkled. "More concerts, more stories to tell. Maybe even teaching, sharing what I've learned with kids who dream big, like I did." He nodded, his expression unreadable but tender. "You'll be brilliant at that, too." The months rolled into years, and Eliza continued to travel and perform. But she also dedicated time to teaching workshops in Savannah, mentoring young musicians who reminded her of herself. The music school she started, aptly named the Carter Academy for Music, flourished, filled with students who shared her love for the art. Martha often sat in the front row at their recitals, her applause the loudest, her pride the deepest. And through it all, the melody Eliza played at every significant moment echoed her father's voice, his belief in her undimmed by time. Evan's visits became more frequent, their shared love for music and connection evolving into something deeper over time. But they never rushed, letting their paths intertwine naturally, like the steady cadence of a familiar song. One late afternoon, Eliza stood in the small music room of her mother's house, the same room where her journey had begun. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the edges of the old violin she held. She lifted it to her shoulder and began to play, the notes wrapping around her like a well-worn coat. The music carried the stories of everyone she had met, every stage she had stood on, every heart she had touched. The last note faded, and she stood in the stillness, knowing she had finally found her place, not just on any stage, but within herself. The applause would come and go, but the music, like hope, would always remain. As Eliza's music played on, echoing in the hearts of those she touched, her story became more than just a tale of ambition. It was an anthem of hope and resilience. Thank you for following Eliza's journey from humble beginnings to the grandest stages. If you enjoyed this story and want more tales of inspiration, don't forget to like this post and subscribe for more. Your support helps us continue creating heartfelt stories that resonate with dreamers everywhere.